Almost 80 years ago, Japan surrendered and ended World War II. It wasn't. But what would have been the main factor that led the Japanese to surrender? Was it the American atomic bombings, or was it the Soviet invasion of Manchuria? Do you want to know? The answer stays with us. Before we get started, let's remember that we're getting close to the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, when Japan finally signed the surrender to the Allies. And so you can know everything that happened, that whole sequence of events. I created a special group on WhatsApp where every day I'm posting news, I'm posting curiosities about those last months of the war. So if you want to be part of this group, click the link in the description. Or you can scan the QR code that's on the screen. I'll be waiting for you there. So let's get into one of the biggest controversies of World War II, right? What brought it to an end? What made the Japanese surrender were the American atomic bombs. Or was it, look here at this beautiful painting, by the way, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria? Which of these two events would have more weight in influencing the Japanese decision to call it quits? Today, so I'll explain to you the sequence of events and factors that ultimately led to that decision, and what weight each of those factors had in that same decision. The reality in Japan in July 1945 was almost like a microcosm within planet Earth. Why is that? Because that Japanese population was the result of an uninterrupted civilization, meaning it never experienced a break in its dominant structure for practically 2,000 years. So you have a population that is highly indoctrinated in the precepts and ethos of what it means to be Japanese. And you also have total media and information control exercised by the Japanese government. This allowed the government in Tokyo to hide even the biggest disasters from the Japanese population. For example, the sinking of 4 Japanese carriers at Midway and the loss of the Mariana Islands, and even the real proximity of the Americans to Japan. Having already landed on the island of Okinawa, Japanese civilization was also imbued with a historical mystique that the elements, that the gods always favored them, and that in cases of extreme national emergency, they would eventually at the last moment be saved by these divine forces. So this made Japanese surrender, even at that advanced stage of the war, something very difficult to consider. This is a photo of the last Japanese cabinet of World War II, which took office on April 7, 1945, around Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki. We'll talk about him in a moment. But here, in this photo, you can already see emblematic figures like Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who was the Minister of the Navy, and the all-powerful General Korochika Hanami, the Minister of War, or Minister of the Army. And, as you can well imagine, April 7, 1945 is not exactly a favored date in Japanese military history. In other words, at that time, the defeats were already overwhelming, already clear, and the country was already under continuous American incendiary bombing. How did this leadership here, how did this cabinet view the war? So even though there were already at this higher level of government elements who wanted to sign a peace agreement, like Admiral Ionai, you also had reactionary elements, those who still felt quite belligerent, like General Hanami. And even though this kind of element still strongly believed in salvation, in the final victory, and they also believed that the loss of all Japanese overseas territories would not be enough reason to consider surrender. They also knew that at this point in the war, there was no longer any possibility of victory. All they wanted at that point was to avoid defeat and avoid defeat. It meant achieving acceptable conditions to maintain Japanese honor at the negotiating table with the Americans. And at that point, these Japanese leaders you're seeing here didn't just sit around waiting for things to happen. They developed an operational concept called ketsugu, and that meant virtually mobilizing almost the entire Japanese population, since the government was already talking at that time about the honorable sacrifice of 100 million in honor of the empire. The way for Japan to achieve this honorable armistice with the United States then would be to fiercely resist the American invasion of Japan itself, causing the Americans to lose an immense, unimaginable number of soldiers in this operation, and with that, make the American public back in the United States lose faith in the war and force their authorities to negotiate with the Japanese authorities. And if you think that's a big problem, from a delusion that the Japanese would never be able to overcome the Americans or even inflict this kind of impact on them, you're completely wrong, because Okinawa was the final proof that this concept was indeed working. The invasion of Okinawa Island, which was initially planned to last only a few weeks, lasted 85 days, and any Marine or soldier who was on the island at that time describes the situation as nothing less than hell on earth. At the cost of tens of thousands of casualties, the Americans had to eliminate almost all Japanese military resistance on the island, and this also resulted in tens of thousands of Japanese civilian casualties. And this made Okinawa the culmination of a process of deterioration of public opinion in the United States, which had started back in the Mariana Islands the previous year, and was worsened by the very bloody conquest of the island, actually, the small island of Iwo Jima, in February 1945. I'm going to do a simple calculation, just a basic rule of 3 to show you. How did Okinawa become the mirror of what the Americans feared most? That it would be repeated in the invasion of Japan itself. Look, on the island of Okinawa, there were 115,000 military defenders. In other words, 115,000 soldiers defending the island, along with some militiamen as well. Out of those 115,000 soldiers, 94,000 of them were killed. 94,000 out of those 115,000 had to be killed by the Americans because they wouldn't surrender. And this Japanese military force caused the Americans 50,000 combat casualties, plus 30,000 non-combat casualties, bringing the total to 80,000 American and British casualties. Now, what's really frightening is that the number of Japanese soldiers available to defend Japan reached 2,280,000 men. So if we apply that rule of 3 I mentioned, if the Americans face this Japanese contingent in Japan, the estimated total casualties would be around 1,586,000 men. And as in Okinawa, the number of deaths compared to the number of wounded was about 1 to 7. The total number of dead would be around 226,583 soldiers. And what if we compare that projected number of deaths? If we compare it to the total number of American deaths in World War II, which was 407,316, we see that this total could increase by more than a third. And personally, I think that estimate of 226,000 is quite conservative. Because if we compare the Japanese logistical situation on a small island like Okinawa to their own country, Japanese resistance in their own country would have much more logistical support and therefore would work much better. It's also reasonable to imagine that the Japanese would have saved or reserved the best of their weaponry and also their most trained troops for the defense of their homeland. So, this number of 226,000 deaths here could easily surpass 400,000 in my estimation. Want to hear what public opinion is? I saw all of this over there in the United States, and how did that affect popular support for the war? Just wait. American public opinion regarding World War II in 1945 is not a topic that's talked about very much. Do you know why? Because it was in sharp decline. It's not that most of the population stopped supporting the war, but the enthusiasm for the war was, in fact, clearly declining. Have you ever seen a picture like this of people rationing lines in the United States? Did you know this happened during World War II? Even though the country was indeed an industrial powerhouse with no parallel, all over the world, the civilian population went through all kinds of restrictions on food and supplies of every kind. And after 4 years of war, this was wearing out the population even more. After the German defeat in May, many people were wondering why continue fighting in the Pacific. And the casualty reports from Iwo Jima and then Okinawa pushed that feeling to its peak during the conflict. A Gallup poll that summer revealed that 70% of the American population supported the unconditional surrender of Japan. But look at this. She was afraid of the cost of that surrender. And what was that fear? The fear of losing a father, a son, a brother, a husband, everyone who would be involved in what was already anticipated. It would be a bloody battle for the takeover of the country. And this American will, so overwhelming, yes, made it so that the government could not consider, for example, prolonging the war, simply surrounding Japan and isolating the country, until Tokyo asked for some kind of peace agreement, which could take years. So, again, it was this situation here that made the White House use every card it had up its sleeve to force the Japanese to give up the war. And that meant initially the firebombing of Japan starting in March 1945, which ultimately completely destroyed 67 Japanese cities. Also in the same month of March, Operation Starvation was launched, which was the massive mining of Japanese ports and the approaches to those ports. Operation Starvation is also very rarely discussed today because its goal was literally to starve Japan to death, preventing supplies, especially food, from reaching the mouths of Japanese citizens from Japan's territories in Manchuria and also in Korea. And the results of Operation Starvation at the end of the month were truly frightening because the tonnage of supplies that was unloaded in Japan that month was less than 1/10 of the amount in February. And finally, of course, the American High Command also authorized the dropping of atomic bombs on Japan, since the country completely ignored the surrender demands of the Potsdam Declaration. So, let's talk a little bit about the Soviet Union now because it's an important part of our topic. And the Soviet Union had a major role to play in the Japanese strategy of resisting the Americans, because within the high-level Japanese planning, Stalin was supposed to be the mediator who would bring the Japanese and Americans to the same table and set honorable conditions for both sides to end the conflict. And why did the Japanese think that Stalin could do that? Because since 1941, since April 1941, Japan and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact, which was established to be valid for 5 years. So it wouldn't expire until 1946. And therefore, Japan and the Soviet Union were friends, even though the Soviet Union was a major ally of the United States in the World War. So, based on everything I'm saying here, were the Japanese really caught by surprise by the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945? And would that have made them give up the war immediately? That's what a lot of people believe, but I'm going to show you why I disagree with that. To begin with, because on April 5th, in the last days of German resistance still in Europe, Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs, publicly denounced the non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Japan. This basically means that the Russians tore up the pact, and from that moment on, there was no longer any Soviet obligation not to enter into armed conflict against the Japanese. Even before that, back in February of that year, At the Yalta Conference, Stalin himself promised Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan, exactly 3 months after ending the war against Germany. So in the midst of these decisions, all made at the highest level, and even publicly announced decisions, like Molotov's announcement, is it possible? All those decisions, didn't they realize the Soviet intention to go to war with them? So, let me show you this. Take a look at this find. This is the O Globo newspaper from Wednesday, June 27, 1945. And do you know what's on the front page of O Globo that day? Take a look at this little article here, see what it says. A Russo-Japanese clash was imminent, with large concentrations of Japanese troops facing Soviet lines in Manchuria. Bern, 27th, that is Bern, in Switzerland, June 27th. The radio station in this capital stating that serious events are underway in the Far East, serious events, especially in northern Manchuria, predicts an imminent Russo-Japanese clash. Backing up its statements, the Swiss radio emphasizes that large concentrations of Japanese troops are gathering in northern Manchuria, facing the Russian lines. It is significant, says the Bern broadcaster, that the United States is supplying materials to Russia under Lend-Lease to be used in Siberia. So you can see here that even Brazilians at that time, like your grandfather, already knew that a war between Russia and Japan could break out at any moment. And the article from OGLOBO also makes clear a key element of the Soviet preparation for war against Japan, which was precisely the Lend-Lease. The Russians used the American Pacific ports to move war supplies across the Pacific, which they themselves would use against the Japanese in 1945. Look, this was a strategic move because the Russians, being in a non-aggression pact with the Japanese, could move their ships without any fear of being attacked by them. And all this material ended up on the Soviet front lines that would break through against the Kwantung Army on August 8, 1945. Even so, the Soviet logistical preparations for this operation were still not 100% complete on the date the attack began, because a few days after the attack began. With the offensive developing at a very fast pace, the Soviet vanguards began to suffer from a lack of all kinds of supplies, especially fuel, which indicates that the start date of the Soviet operation may indeed have been moved up due to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. I'm explaining here that although the Soviet logistical preparations may have experienced a delay, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima may have suggested to Stalin that the Japanese would respond with an immediate surrender. So what made him move up the launch of the offensive to meet the exact 3-month deadline that Stalin had given the Allies at Yalta? And I'm sure you've already done the math, right? May 8, 1945, August 8, 1945, that's exactly 3 months. So what the historical evidence shows us is that the Kwantung Army, the largest Japanese area army at that time, was preparing to face a Soviet invasion in northeastern China. However, they got the date wrong, because the Japanese estimated that the Soviets would not be ready to attack before the second half of September or even the beginning of October. And the documentation from the Kwantung Army itself shows that their defensive lines were scheduled to be ready only in October. And in fact, the Japanese faith in this date was so strong that it was only when Ambassador Sato met with Molotov on the night of August 8th there in Moscow. Molotov then gave it to Sato. The Soviet declaration of war on Japan was when the Japanese first got a hint that they were about to be attacked. As I already mentioned, the Soviet attack happened in the early hours between August 8th and 9th, and on the morning of August 9th, the second atomic bomb falls on Nagasaki and the result of the second atomic bombing. I've also already discussed this here in our Nagasaki video, minute by minute. It's that the Japanese now have confirmation that the Americans possess a vast arsenal of atomic bombs. And now, the complete destruction of their country would surely come, and at a very low cost to the Americans. A guy who's often forgotten, but who played a big role in the decision made by the Japanese High Command on August 9th. It's this guy here, Marcus McDilda, who was a P-51 pilot from the 7th Fighter Command based in Iwo Jima. On August 8th, this guy was carrying out a ground attack mission in Osaka, Japan, when he was shot down by Japanese anti-aircraft fire. McDilda. Then he was captured by the Japanese. He was arrested and paraded through the streets of Osaka, where he was beaten and stoned by the population. And after that, he was taken to a cell, where he was interrogated and violently tortured by the Kempei Tai, the feared Japanese secret police. And then, a Japanese officer asked Makudilda about the American nuclear arsenal, threatening him with death with the tip of his sword. So Makudilda replied to the American officer that the United States had hundreds of atomic bombs in its arsenal, and that soon, several cities, including Tokyo and Kyoto, would be pulverized by atomic bombs. Makudilda had no idea what he meant. He made all of that up because he was afraid of dying and said what his interrogator wanted to hear. And this completely false testimony from an American pilot reached the Council of the Six in Tokyo and had a tremendous impact on the events of the following hours. Then you think that the Japanese War Council decided to surrender, right? But no, that wasn't the case. The council was always split in half. 3 members wanted peace and 3 members wanted to continue the war. And even after the news of the second atomic bomb and the news of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, none of the 3 pro-war members changed their minds, right? The Japanese surrender was actually the result of a major break in protocol by this old man you're seeing here, this one. This is the Prime Minister of Japan, Kantaro Suzuki, who was already over 75 years old, quite elderly, as you can see here. And it was in April 1945, summoned by the emperor himself, because the emperor personally trusted Suzuki, and secretly, he told him that his mission was to lead the country to peace. So at the end of that August 9th, another meeting of the council once again ended in a deadlock. No resolution, because 3 wanted peace and 3 wanted war. It was Suzuki who stood up, and knowing that the Katsugo plan was now doomed because there was no longer a mediator, no one could appeal to the Soviet Union anymore to get the Americans to sit at a negotiating table with the Japanese. The Prime Minister stands up and, making a deep bow to the Emperor, earnestly requests that the Emperor express his opinion. And this is exactly the breach of protocol I mentioned to you, because the Emperor never spoke at these sessions. He was simply present to approve what the counselors decided. But once his personal opinion is asked, the Emperor says that the country cannot continue taking that kind of punishment, and that the time had come to endure the unbearable and accept surrender. So, I'll conclude by showing you this image here, which I think perfectly illustrates the Japanese situation in 1945. A delicious layer cake topped with red cherries. And why do I use this analogy here? Because we can see in each of these layers the reasons why the Japanese surrendered in World War II. We can start from the base there, with the loss of territories and the loss of global prestige, followed by the strategic firebombing of the cities, then the starvation operation, and the massive drop in the level of the most basic supplies, like food and fuel. Finally, the atomic bombs here, which destroyed one city after another with a single plane. And then you have the icing on the cake, which is the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, eliminating the possibility that their strategic plan to achieve a mediated peace with the Americans could happen. But think with me here, what would the cherry be without all these layers of chocolate underneath? The Soviet offensive was indeed an absolute success, which devastated the Kwantung Army over the following 7 days. But let's remember that the Japanese decision to surrender happened less than 24 hours after the start of the Soviet offensive. So, up until the moment the emperor announced his intention to surrender, no one yet knew the real extent that the Soviet offensive would have. And what about the difference between the dates of August 9 and August 15, which was when the emperor actually announced the surrender? It happened because of the distance between the two nations, the United States and Japan, and also the difficulties in transcribing and translating the peace offers and their respective responses. Now I think it's time to wrap up because this cake is making me hungry. So tell me now, did you manage to better understand the sequence of events, the sequence of factors that led to the Japanese surrender? Do you agree with my conclusions? Tell us here in the comments if you want to better understand the details of one of the main components of this decision. Then buy my book, The Atom as a Weapon, which is for sale on Amazon and also at the WeClap store. I'm sure you'll learn a lot from this book. So click the link in the description or scan the QR code here. If you like this video, then share it with your friends too. Give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the War Room so you don't miss anything else. I'll wrap it up here. Thanks again for watching, and here's a big hug from the War Room.